welcome to another Mike Flanders podcast. Today we have Mike Kraski, and Mike has a long music business history. And say hello to Mike. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Mike.
Isn't that crazy, eh? So I met Mike several years ago through a mutual musician friend. We've gone on to being friends and kicking around a lot of different balls. I've written songs for artists that he's worked with and recorded singles and done all kinds of stuff. And, during the, this whole podcasting involvement, I've tried to now make it interesting for people to listen and understand that, who we are, what we're attached to, how the business has changed, how it's developing. And it's interesting as, you and I both are old enough to have sons and kids in business, and I've watched my son and my kids now with, how they're streaming and how they're listening and what's hot and what they're favouring. And now, I don't know if you've even come across this TikTok thing that they're, I'm like, what is this, and there's so many different people that, don't do TikTok. It's funny now how you see the kids and their involvement in the phone in your hand, and that is our format in a sense, isn't it? It is. It's now, I never thought after all these years that I would actually have an iPhone with my playlist and knowing how to add those songs, and now I've got all my favourite stuff if I go for a walk or a jog and blah, blah, blah. Back, we came from records and cassettes. I never had those 8-tracks, then CDs, and now in this digital world, we were starting to, I came from analog tape to, ADATs, to DATs, obviously, and I know radar was popular here in Nashville. I don't know if you ever worked on, in the studio where people were using radar, but I believe it was popular here. We saw these Sony digital machines to now Pro Tools, and I don't know if you've seen what's happening with Pro Tools. Now Universal Audio are coming out with their own DAW, and so there's all this digital fighting over to the left. But anyway, I'm kind of getting off track a little bit. These advancements are just going crazy at the moment. And in our world, we're trying to, provide our clients with, some kind of service that is as professional as what we used to. And we're trying to do it on a smaller budget. But in our minds, we are still where we used to be, and we understand where the bar should be. I think that is the most difficult kind of place that it's put us in. Would you think?
I think so, and I think it starts with how much the world has changed. The world of the internet, the world of streaming and social media platforms has done what I call the great democratization of music. There's an opportunity for artists to make a direct connection to consumers, where before the only way to get to consumers were through the primary gatekeepers. You needed to be signed to the label because it was the way for you to be able to amplify your message through radio airplay that's predominantly controlled by the major labels. And the same with publicity. Years ago, you lived for the opportunity to be on Oprah. You lived for the opportunity to be on Leno. Now there are so many platforms where you can at least get your voice out. The issue is, how can you amplify your message in today's world through all the white noise? With this democratization has eliminated filters, and that's a challenge because every aspiring artist believes that they are good enough, and they're not.
No.
And that's the challenges for those fans of music. The discovery process is more challenging, I think, than it used to be.
I call it digital litter.
Well, and that's a good way to really describe it, because there is a lot of that, and it's not to diminish or indemnify these artists who are chasing their dreams. I applaud them all. But that's the challenge for us within the business. If you have an act that has decided or has no choice but to set up their own cottage industry, at least temporarily, because they have to be their own label. When you're doing what I do, which is management and artist development and artist consulting, you have to wear an awful lot of hats, or help teach them to wear an awful lot of hats.
Well, totally. Even as a producer, well, let's flip back. So, my history coming into the corporate music world, Warner Chappell was the first thing for me, where I started to understand the business. And that was exactly the same, where there was processes, and you knew what the processes were. And as a writer, producer, I then developed artists that then you had, your only mission was to get them signed. And there was no other way. We didn't think about indie labels back in the 90s, in the early 90s. That started to, I suppose, even what we classified, I suppose, as indies would have been, was it like Maverick, or what was the huge label that came out of LA? I'm trying to remember its name, but they were what we classified as indies, but they still had major distribution, and
that's right.
They were plugged in. Even my BMG days, there was multiple labels under that umbrella that were technically indies, but they were co-ventures,
right?
Because they brought something to the table, like Amazing Act and money and blah 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 blah. Interscope is what I was thinking.
There you go. Yeah.
Would have you classified Interscope as an indie back? It was, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I it's always blurred lines. It's a gray area on what you define it, because some of those indies, as you said, were plugged into majors. So that are they really just a piece of a major, or are they indies on steroids? It all varied. But the one thing that has primarily remained true through all these years is innovation comes from outside the majors.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, at one point in time, I had a conversation with a senior executive in New York when I was at Sony, and we had the conversation about innovation, because I wanted to start an Americana label at Sony Nashville, and his premise was simply this: we don't have to do that, because we let somebody else innovate and then we buy it.
Yeah,
and that's the truth of a lot of what happens with the major labels is, and I think what that means is there's always an importance to having a healthy indie world, because that is where musical innovation comes from. So.
But Sony is a funny thing, because, I don't know how many years you spent there, but we'll dive into that. But Mottola once said, I never have to really make a record if I don't want to, because they come across my desk every day, and they were records.
Right.
So, it's a statement, isn't it? A true statement. So dive back to the listeners and let them know, your history at Sony, and maybe throw a good story in there, like a Dixie Chicks story or something, because people love the realism of what people have done in their life,
Well, I'm a little older than you are, so I go back to 8-tracks, actually. I started...
Oh, I did too. I started on 8-track machine.
I started working in the music business in 1975, while I was still in college.
At school. Yep.
And I worked as an inventory clerk for CBS Records in the basement warehouse of a record chain called National Record Mart. And it was my job to physically take inventories. This was before UPC codes. This was before scanning, and you just had to physically count every album and every 8-track. And even when I first started, there were still a couple sections for monaural records, actually. So I've seen all of the transitions in consumption in the modern era, short of, I guess, 78 RPMs. I never sold any of those.
No. Saw them. Dad had some.
I started as an inventory clerk and then became a sales rep while I went to school full time, and came to learn early on what the important elements and processes are. And I'll touch on this now simply because even though so much has changed, some things remain true. And those are the early lessons that I took to heart. And it's simply that the process of becoming a fan for an act starts with hearing a song and loving the song. And that's still the case today.
Without a doubt.
But back then, what you did was you heard it on the radio and you went to your favorite record store and you bought a single. And then if you heard another song that you loved by that artist, you bought another single. Then you buy the album. And then you buy a ticket to a show. And that begins the process of becoming a fan. And that hasn't changed.
No.
It's just that the vehicles for the discovery process have changed immensely because it's all available 24/7. And it's just a challenge to go through the process to discover. Because in our eras when we began, you had Top 40 radio, and you had American Bandstand. You had the Ed Sullivan Show. There were very few vehicles, so the whole world engaged in the same discovery process. Now a lot of those things are minimalized or have disappeared and have been replaced by a ton of different platforms. But back to my history, I ended up being a sales rep into the 80s and then became a sales manager for CBS Records, which became Sony. I moved in 1987 to Dallas, Texas, and spent 2 years being the sales manager for the Southwest region of the United States. And in that time, we were very fortunate and broke a number of country acts out of our branch, including Ricky Van Shelton and Shenandoah and Rodney Crowell. And that got the attention of Sony Nashville, and they invited me to come to Nashville and be their VP of sales. And that's how I got here in 1989. When I got here, it's one of those wistful moments where you look back and realize, geez, I wish I would have treasured that moment more, because I came at a point in the crossroads of Sony Nashville, because we still had Willie Nelson and Johnny Cash and Tammy Wynette and George Jones, Ricky Skaggs, all these brilliant, historic figures that were nearing the end of their era with CBS and Sony, and I wish I knew then what I knew now, because I would have done so much more with them, you know. But from 1989 to 2003, I worked at Sony Nashville, eventually becoming the executive VP and general manager of the division. And had just a blessing of a time with the artists with whom I had the opportunity to work with them. Acts like Dixie Chicks, Montgomery Gentry, Mary Chapin Carpenter, Patty Loveless, Joe Diffie, Colin Ray, Doug Stone, all the platinum and multi-platinum successes that we all had together, and made a lot of history in that time.
So who was the New York head back then? Was it that was pre-Mottola, wasn't it?
I'm trying to remember. It was mostly, my era there was mostly Mottola.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It was the big tycoon Sony guy that they wrote the book of Howling at the Moon. What was his name? The famous guy.
It'll come to me. I'll blurt it out somewhere in the process here. But I was
Yetnikoff.
Walter Yetnikoff, yes, and I'd been in his office a couple of times when I first started there. But my time in being the liaison to New York as an executive in Nashville was very much more the Tommy Mottola era.
Right.
I think people will find this a little bit of interest. Tommy's number two guy was more of a financial guy, but he was really, really smart. And I came to understand the culture of major labels in one meeting with him, because he came into Nashville and all the senior executives were in the room. And he looked at all of us and said, anytime there's a failure with one of the acts that's been signed here, it's somebody's fault here in this room. If the act should never been signed, then it's the fault of the label head and the A&R staff. If the music wasn't right, it's the fault of the A&R staff. If the music was right and it didn't get played, it's the fault of the promotion team. And if they got the airplay and the music was right and it didn't sell, it's the fault of marketing and sales. So it's going to be somebody's fault in this room. And I quickly realized that defined the culture at major labels and created a situation where everyone was looking more to cover their butts than to have a passion for the music and do everything they can to make it a success, because they couldn't afford to have a failure put at their feet. So as an example of how that breaks down and creates a problem, you would have promotion choosing singles that were the easiest to work up the charts instead of the song that would really drive people to go and purchase a single or a CD at the time. The songs that speak to a consumer, make them smile, make them think, make them cry. It speaks for them. Those songs were the last ones that would ever get released because they were too challenging, and promotion didn't want to risk a failure. And that's where you ended up, and it continues today. There's a lemming kind of mindset that, oh, geez, that label had success with that style of an act, I have to go find another one of those. And that's where you get the assembly line mentality at the major labels. And that's why I continue to point to the fact that innovation comes from the indies for the most part. But for that very reason.
Take it back to Meatloaf.
I think another great example of why any aspiring artist should not be devastated when they're told no is a story I share with Little Big Town. Little Big Town was signed at Sony in the last years I was there, and Little Big Town chose to work with the head of A&R as our producer, not because he was the best fit, but because they wanted to ensure that they would be a priority at the label. And what was created was more of a pop concoction than it was an album that was true to the vision that Little Big Town had for themselves. And because it was a pop concoction, everything that followed, so it would be consistent and congruent with the music, also came off like a pop concoction. And we spent over $1 million on Little Big Town and sold 15,000 units in the life of the record. Fast forward a little bit, and their manager came to me and played me a few songs that blew my mind. They had found their new producer, whose name is Wayne Kirkpatrick, and there was just this great, beautiful musical vibe. There was a really swampy song that just caught my ear, and after 4 songs, I went, boy, they found it. This is awesome. So they took it to the rest of the staff, and the head of A&R, who was no longer the producer, passed. So did the head of promotion, because politically he didn't want to get on the other side of the head of A&R, and the president concurred, and they were dropped from the label.
Was Boondocks in that
Well,
one of those songs?
I'll get to that because a few weeks later, Little Big Town was dropped from the label, and a few months later, Sony decided to make a clean sweep of the executive staff at Sony Nashville, myself included. So after I left there, a few weeks later, I met with Clint Black and his business manager and his manager, and we agreed to build and create an artist-friendly label model called Equity Records. And Clint, of course, was the first artist on the roster. But shortly after that, Little Big Town came to me with an album that was finished, and we signed them. And we released a song called Boondocks, which was the same song I heard in my office at Sony. Yeah. And with the launch of that and 3 other songs that were on that very same album that I heard all became top 5 hits. We sold 1.5 million units. And it was the independent album of the year, all genres. And I share this story with you just to reinforce the fact that it's important that the artist maintains control of their own vision. Yeah. And everyone still needs to learn to stay in their own lane. Yeah. The most important thing I learned in all those years was let the artist be the artist. Yeah. And if you believe in what they're doing, then it's your job to help them articulate that vision to the marketplace, not to create the vision for them. Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Brilliant. Yeah, I heard that I was not even moved to the United States. I was in Susan Berger's car because she was admin for Mushroom Music Australia. So she was one of my connections when I used to come over here before moving in the early 2000s. And we went out to meet a friend, and she was to drop me back to the hotel, and she said, have a listen to this song. And I'm no word of a lie, she played me that song. No kidding. Yeah, well, I suppose she was doing a lot of consulting, and she was very friendly with horses and blah, blah, blah with Tim Whipperman, who I'd known Tim from Warner Chappell. So by the time I'd got to Warner Chappell, Nashville, Tim had left, but I still had met him through other people, and Dale Bobo was running the show. Ah, right. So, and they were signed to Tim, right? Mm-hmm. So this whole development would have been going on, and people were sharing, and I suppose she had a CD of, but that was the only song she had on the CD. So I don't know how, even though other stuff was recorded, they were obviously sharing that amongst industry people at right, because it was the first single, so that was the first that the town heard, and it was interesting in how we repositioned Little Big Town into the marketplace, because there was a belief amongst the industry and fans alike that those 4 pretty people were put together. That didn't happen organically, and nothing could be further from the truth. They found themselves, and it's a shame that pretty ends up backfiring on you, but it did at the time. So the first thing we did was understated everything we did visually with Little Big Town, so we could rebuild the perception of their artistry, and just focused on music. So there weren't visuals out at first, and the visuals that we did use were very subtle and underplayed. Your listeners might find this interesting. In the life of this, you of course know the ending, that tag that repeats, right? Yep. Which is the hook that everyone sings along to. They sing along to it in arenas today when they see him perform live. There was a station in Houston that would not add the record unless that was removed, and we never removed it. Really? We told them no. And stood our ground, and I'm sharing that for the same reason. Wow. Don't let somebody talk you out of what you believe in your heart is the right thing. And what was the hook at the end it's been a long time since. Yeah, me too. And I'm not a singer. I can't sing it. But any fan who knows Boondocks knows the end, that there's a repeat, and each of the singers take a different part. And it's very catchy and hooky, and it was just stunning to me. There's always an excuse. Wow. When we had Doug Stone with his first hit at radio called Pine Box. the hook talked about the coming home in a pine box, and there was one station that would not add the record because one of their advertisers was a funeral director.
Oh wow!
And that was their excuse. There's always an excuse.
Wow.
Anyone in town knows who Jeffrey Steele is,
Yep.
because he's one of the most successful songwriters of all time. But before that, he was the lead singer in a group called Boy Howdy, and after that, we signed him at Sony on the Monument label. He was supposed to be the follow-up to Dixie Chicks. And if you've never seen Jeffrey Steele, you get a chance, go.
Yeah.
He's the most exciting live act I had ever seen to that point since Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah, passion.
He is absolutely electric. He had star written all over him. So his first single that was supposed to come out on 9/11 was called "Something in the Water." And because of 9/11 and the fears, no one would add it. It had nothing to do with anything that happened on 9/11, but that was that excuse, and it just imploded. So there's always those stories.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. Well, I think today that's kind of where I wanted to drive. I wanted to talk about, where we all start, where we all end, and we're not over. Someone said to me the other day, Mike, that last 25 years, well, now it's the last 5 years. We've got to kind of figure it out from this last 5 years, how it's all changed, because back, all that's gone away. So, but I'm kind of like you. There's components of everything that's never gone away. And you use the word cottage, and living in a smaller environment like Australia, you had to run your business like a little cottage industry.
Yeah.
And so people would come to me after the credit crunch here and say, oh, what are you going to do? And I'm like, business as usual. I mean, this is kind of what we grew up in the music world in Australia, because there wasn't. Someone said to me at one point when that CDX guy started the business here in Nashville, there was like 27 labels they were servicing, major kind of conglomerates or whatever, down to what, 4 are we now? Are we? Yeah. So, at home, at the largest level, there was probably 4. The 4 majors.
Right.
And then there wasn't that many indies. There would have been a few indies, but probably not indies with a lot of money.
Right.
I mean, some little indies were nearly out the door, and one of them grabbed hold of that English version or whatever of the Eva Cassidy record and made a few million. You'd hear stories like that,
Right.
I don't know if she was ever famous here, Eva Cassidy, but she became enormous in Australia due to this one record, and this woman that died of cancer, and this record appeared and ended up in millions of people's hands,
Right.
So these little stories, as we all know, just pop up and blah, blah, blah. But, for me, nothing has really ever changed other than how do we help the people we love, that we work with, that we think have potential. And that's really what this conversation's about, is you're passionate about somebody that you're working with that you think has got longevity. I feel the same way. I've got some artists I've worked with and continuing to work with where I love them as humans. We collaborate, our blood is on it together because we're writing the song and we're developing the song. And you always, it's like planting the seed. You want it to grow and you want to see the flowers. But there's limitations, and the limitations usually the folding stuff, isn't it?
Right.
How do we get through the folding stuff? And I think people have a very false perception of what social media can and can't do for an artist because of digital litter.
Right.
You and I both probably go back to when Bubbly came out, right? When Colby put that out on really the first ever social media platform, which
Right.
was MySpace. And I saw that. I was shared it. I'm sure you were shared it. And that was at our point in our lives. I think we were all like, wow, how did this happen?
Right.
You know, but there's stories behind that and who she came from and the breeding. You know, I think she was the daughter of the guy that mixed Fleetwood Mac records or something. I can't remember the story, but there's always more than what you're fed. There's some political or powerful connections, because
Right.
you and I know there always
That's
has
correct.
to be a fire starter, and you've got to be able to be connected, and I think that's our job. Whether I'm a creator of the music, we're still important that we're connectors, and I think that's what you've told the listeners today is, you know, if Little Big Town didn't come into the office and you didn't hear Boondocks, and then they didn't come back to you, it's all connection. You know, your connection at Sony changed their lives when Equity started.
Right. It did, and I think for those that are listening to this podcast that are aspiring artists, I think yes, it's valuable to have representation, to have some people around you, but I think the most important thing you can do is learn to do and do as much of it as you can yourself, first of all. And remember one thing, that your fans are everything at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And if there is one thing that has changed dramatically from the time I started in the business to today, is the fans' relationship with the artist that they worship.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example. And if there's anyone that has been a client of mine, they've heard this story. But my religion was Bruce Springsteen. I thought the man was the greatest artist of all time, and he spoke to me because I was living the life of what I heard on Wild Innocent and East Street Shuffle and Born to Run. Those I listened to constantly, and I understood that my relationship with Bruce Springsteen was simply this. Whenever a new album came out, I would listen to it to death and accept the fact that I wouldn't hear any new material from my favorite artist for at least 2 years, and probably longer. And I would worship Bruce Springsteen from afar in the audience whenever he was up on stage. You know, today fans expect a direct one-on-one relationship with their artists. And if you as an artist are not catering to that, they're going to move on to another artist. So that you have to understand that, you know, it's just not putting stuff out on social media. You have to understand that you're trying to make a connection. And when someone responds to you, put in the time and respond back. And also understand they're not going to wait for 2 years. So you have to feed the monster, as I call it, every single week, or they're going to move on to somebody else. So whether it's you're doing a cover of an artist that you think your fans would like to hear, or use that as a way to engage artist of the artist you're covering to discover you, either way, it's something you need to do. You need to bring them on the inside of your life, and the more you're willing to do that, the more connected that they are going to become. And you have to choose where that line is. You know, that with some people, they're never going to see my children on any social media platforms. Others, they are absolutely transparent, and they take you on the entire journey with them. And if you are an aspiring artist, learn these rules. Your social media numbers are very important, but equally important is he or she who has the most emails and phone numbers wins. Social media platforms go away, and anyone that lived through MySpace knows that. And anyone who really relied on Twitter now understand that so many of those people are over on Instagram now, and you have to start all over again. And reconnecting with your fans. People don't change their email addresses very often at all.
No.
So when you're out there on the road and doing a show, make sure that there's a way for them to sign up and give you their email address, their zip code, and their phone number. And that way, whenever you're coming to town, you can use today's technology to geo-target those fans and connect with them whenever you're doing a show in the marketplace. So all those things, it starts, you gain one and then you gain another. But there's truly a geometric progression to that growth. And if you really stick to it, you'll come to a time where you've added a lot of zeros to that one. From to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 and on upward. And all of those things feed into where the money comes from these days, and in large part that's streaming. Touring and streaming are where most of the money is for artists who are doing it themselves. What I do when I take on a client is we build parallel paths. If they aspire to be with a major label. And we build a path to build all the things that a label's looking for: competitive music, a vibrant touring history, and good social media metrics. But the percentage of artists that want to be on a major label and end up on one is challenging, to say the least. So we build the other path. So we're building that cottage industry, and then they can choose when they get to a crossroads whether they want to give up a piece of their money so they can someday play stadiums, or they're making so much money that they don't want to give it to a label and share it. And that's what today's business really is about, is making that choice. And it just depends on what you want at the end of the day, if you're blessed enough to have the choice. But if you don't have the choice, at least you're building something that's sustainable.
Well, and it's your business.
That's right.
It's funny, I watched the Bruce Springsteen documentary on the way back on the plane, and I've always thought, I as you, Born to Run, I was 15 when it came out, and it just blew my mind, absolutely blew my mind. But before that, I was a Dylan fan, always have been. And I think the interesting thing about what you just said is the mystery of those artists is what's gone away today. And people that you could never communicate with, some of these artists, big artists, are controlling their own Instagram. And you can instant message them.
Right.
You can direct message them. It's astounding to think that these people, like a Reese Witherspoon, for instance, are controlling certain things.
Right. And
I think that the older generation, we think, they can't be. But they are.
Yeah.
I've always been a friend and a friend and a fan of guitar player out of Austin, Texas, called Eric Johnson. And Eric went on to selling, over $1 million records as a guitar player, and he sings too, but incredible, well-known guitar player. And he was so shy and so introverted and so into what he was doing. But these days, he's posting and the videos. Hey, I'm on tour and I'm doing this, and here's the new guitar Fender and I have created. And think, wow, how far he's come along as an individual that didn't want to have any communication with the outside world except practice, learn, and be the best he could at his craft.
Right, right.
That's all. To stay in the industry and to make a living, he's had to grow as a human, And
well, I guess the question is, has he? Because there's certainly a sense of safety when you're communicating via social media versus face to face. So it's a blessing for a shy artist. Because they can be more transparent and open up and not fearing a reaction from the person sitting across from them. Now they just have to fear trolls. I guess.
It's a whole different world, isn't it? I think we got somewhere, Mike. And so if people are looking to hire Mike or work with Mike, tell them how they get hold of you.
You can reach me at our management company is called New Vision Artist Management, and you'll find it on we have a website, newvision.com, and you can email me at mike@newvisionam as in artistmanagement.com.
There you go. Thanks for coming over. It's another Mike Flanders podcast, and you were listening to Mike Kraski today. Thank you, and I hope you're enjoying these listens. Cheers. Goodbye.
Mm-hmm.